We're on our Battle for Your Heart series, and I think we're stuck permanently on a generous heart. I didn't anticipate going this long on one part of the heart, but it is so incredibly important, so pivotal in how we live our life, and what God points out to us through that. So that's where we're going. Today's is a generous heart takes intentionality. I think that's a word. It's a $5 word anyway. But it takes intentionality, and we've been answering the questions, what is a generous heart? And we've answered that one, I believe. And then we're on how do I get one? And we're in that, and next week we're going to start in on how do I keep one? Because it's not going to stay there forever if we don't do some work to keep it there. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. So the idea of a generous heart is still where we're going. I wrote down verses that we're going to go through, so you have time to look. Our key verse is going to come out of Samuel 9:1. And one thing, generosity that we're talking about, a generous heart, is not about tithing. So we're not hitting you up for money. It has nothing to do with that. It's about a generous heart that we'll talk about way more than that. Let's bow for a word of prayer as we begin. Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for warm cars, warm houses, warm church, and where we can gather even on a horrible cold day and look at your word and learn and study and try to be more of what you would want us to be. Help us as we cultivate a generous heart in ourselves and as you mold our hearts to do that. Guide us by your Holy Spirit, I pray. Amen. On the bottom there, I wrote what we had a couple weeks ago, expectation plus remembering reality, which I thought you had such a good word when you said reality, when we had R-E up there, because it is remembering what is really real, not some fantasy in our mind, plus gratitude equals a generous heart, which leads to generous eyes and generous hands. And that's where David is going. Turn to 2 Samuel 9:1 is where we're going to start out at. And we're finding David as a king. He's settled into the king's palace, done all that. And then we find in verse 1, it says, and David said, is there yet anyone left in the house of Saul that I may what? Show him kindness for Jonathan's sake. Show him the kindness of God. And we talked about that 2 weeks ago, is how can David was sitting there asking, how can I show God's kindness to someone else? And I kind of laid that out, that we should be doing that as family in the morning or in the evening and talk among our families and say, how can I show kindness to someone else? Or who can I show kindness to someone else? Did anyone try that as a family? Nobody yet? Not yet? But you will, right? I think it is such a great example that David, who had so much going on, that he would sit down at the table and thinking about all of the things that were going on because he was king, said, how can we show kindness to someone else? And then we get into the story of Mephibosheth. I always get that wrong. Miffy, I think we called him 2 weeks ago. About who was Mephibosheth? Mephibosheth. Jonathan's son and grandson. Yep, his grandson. And what had happened to him? Where was he at? What had happened to him in this whole exchange of Saul being king to David being king?
Yeah. Injured and crippled and I don't remember where he was looking.
Yeah. How did he get hurt?
He got dropped, didn't he? Yeah, they were running.
Yeah. They were trying, when this whole transition happened, someone that was taking care of him fell down, broke both of his ankles, and they didn't have an orthopedic surgeon at the time, so he spent his life being crippled which was a bad, so he not only was not living in the palace anymore, the king's grandson, but he was in a place called Loamar, far away, and so God said, we need to find this guy. Or David said, we need to find this guy and bring him back. And so we've got this whole story of going down and finding Mephibosheth and telling him to come back. And we talked about what would have been Mephibosheth's thought when somebody knocks on his door and says, King David would like to have a word with you. He'd like you to come on up to Jerusalem. What would have been the norm of that day for thoughts going through your mind?
Probably fear. I mean, they're questioning why would he want to talk to me, or fear because he was the enemy of his father. So.
Yeah, probably big time fear, because in those days, kings pretty much cleaned house. You got rid of anybody who could be an enemy, anybody who could threaten your kingdom or your throne. And so that was probably racing through his mind. And David's words to the servant and to Mephibosheth when he came back was, do not be afraid. Everything you have heard about me as David may not have been true because you were hearing it from the enemy's side. You were hearing it from Saul's side. But this is my intentions for you. And what did he offer Mephibosheth? Remember? Yeah. David said, I'm going to give you back all of the things that were rightly going to be yours if Saul was still king, if Jonathan was still here. That is going to be yours. And not only that, you come and live with us, or live near us. You come and eat at my table. You come and be part of the family. And so this had to be a huge surprise to Mephibosheth. It was just something that you would not expect at all for a king to say to someone who was dethroned, or a family that was dethroned. The picture that we get out of here is so much like imagining ourselves as Mephibosheth, and that's kind of the picture I think God was trying to get across to us, is that we are Mephibosheths. And God sent a servant to get Mephibosheth out of a far country. God sent Jesus, his son, to come get us from a far country. We were afar off. Romans tells us we were enemies of God. We did not love God. God loved us before we ever thought of loving him and did all of that. So this was an early picture of what God was going to do for us. Part of when I was in college, a lot of what we did, when you look at this in the vein of evangelism, a lot of what we did was cold evangelism. The 4 spiritual laws were big at that time, and so we'd grab a packet of 4 spiritual laws and head out to the West Mall out in Omaha and walk around and find people, and it was just cold evangelism. And there wasn't, I mean, they trained us on how to, which wasn't a whole lot. You sit down and you read through God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, and go through the 4 spiritual laws. And so it was kind of impersonal. And so we knew how to evangelize people we didn't know. Where we're going with this is, how do we evangelize people we do know? How do we get to people that we don't just walk up to our brother or sister, or people we run into, or people at work, and sit down and read the 4 spiritual laws to them, and then walk away and we never see them again? It's a whole different deal. So how do we handle that? How do we evangelize people that we see every day? And that's where this generous heart comes into play in such a big time. David didn't just have head knowledge. He didn't just have it up here of the things he needed to say. He had heart knowledge, which meant he knew how to reach out to people. Matthew 10:42, if you don't want to look at that one quick. What does it take to be a generous-hearted evangelist? Where are we going with that? Someone want to look up Matthew 10:42.
And if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these disciples, one of these ones, because he is my disciple, I tell you the truth, he will certainly not lose his reward.
Cup of cold water. What is that? How hard is that for us to do? And what does that tell us in that verse about what a generous heart starts out as doing? Very small things. A cup of water is going to show what? God's generosity, God's kindness towards someone else. Something as small as a cup of water. And in Matthew, Jesus even rebukes those who wouldn't, the Pharisees and Sadducees, who, when he said, when I was thirsty, did you give me something to drink? When I was hungry, did you give me something to eat? You know, they were rebuked because they didn't even do that. They didn't even do the simplest, generous thing of giving someone a cup of water. So it can start with just simple acts, just simple things that we can do. And then verbally, things come after that. A generous heart, I should write this down. A generous heart begins with one. Number one is we have to, is us giving our hearts to God. So that's number one. Number two is us giving our lives to God. So how is that different? Where are we going with that? How is it different for us giving our hearts to God from giving our lives to God?
When we give our heart like we feel it, but our lives we need to do it, like act it.
Yeah.
Physically.
Yeah. To the reality part, yeah. It's the everyday living. It's the things that we do, not just I've got a change in my life, but it doesn't change anything in the things I do and think and say. So we have to give our lives to God. So it's turning on not just a small part of myself, but it's turning over my whole self. When we do that, we become more and more like God. So when our lives are filled with God, when we turn our lives over to God, we become more and more like God. So when people see us, they see less of us and more of God. Less of us, more of God. And that's the direction we want to go. We don't want the focus to be on us. We want the focus to be on God. I think and it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, is one of the things that we do, or we're kind of told to do, sadly, in evangelism, is when you find someone, tell them your story. Tell them how God changed your life. And I can't find that anywhere in the Bible. When the disciples went out, or anyone in the New Testament went out, they told God's story, Jesus' story. What had he done for you? What has he done for you? We can tell them our story, but then we get called hypocrites and all of that stuff because we don't do it right all the time. So our task is to tell people that aren't Christians God's story, that Jesus died on the cross for them, not how Jesus died on the cross for me. And you get where I'm going? It needs to be there for their personal good. And then the last one is that will lead to being extravagantly generous. Giving our hearts to God, giving our lives to God, we become more like God. And God of all things is extravagantly generous. How do we see God's extravagant generosity? Let's pick out the Old Testament first. How did we see God's extravagant generosity in the Old Testament? Any ideas? We don't often think of a generous God in the Old Testament.
His promises to Abraham and,
Which were what? Put you on the spot.
well, his descendants and his faithfulness forever. So,
Yeah. He promised Abraham that he would be his descendants would be as a and he was so generous to Abraham when how did Abraham display generosity between him and Lot? Remember that story of generosity? Jeff knows it.
He just took Lot and showed him the area, and Lot chose the best. And Abraham gave it to him, and Abraham went where it wasn't as pleasant.
Yeah, to say the least. I don't know if there is a pleasant place in that Israel area, but out of Abraham's generous heart, because God had been generous to him, he said, "Okay, Lot, you pick the place you want to go." And Lot picked the flat areas where there was grass for his livestock, and Abraham took the poor spot. That was generosity, because God had shown generosity to Abraham. Abraham was able to show generosity to Lot, and then later on, saving Lot's life out of Sodom and Gomorrah. Any other examples that come to your mind of Old Testament generosity? We studied one, what was that, a year or so ago, about Hosea, the story of Hosea, the generosity of Hosea to his wife Gomer, that even when she left him to go be a harlot in town, he was generous toward her, went and bought her back. A beautiful example of Jesus buying us back. That generous heart that God was showing through Hosea. If you really sit down and look at or think about some of the stories in the Old Testament, that generosity of God's heart comes through. And when people get a hold of it, it changes their life, and it changes the things that they do and the way they act toward others when they don't deserve it. How about the New Testament? What do we see about generosity, generous hearts? We're more familiar with that, probably.
For the feeding of 5,000, but that's usually the generosity is always what I can think of. It's come either from God or from Jesus.
Yeah. So that was an example, wasn't it, of his generosity, caring about the physical needs of the crowd. They were getting hungry. So took the loaves and fish and broke them to feed the people, the disciples. What else?
story of the Good Samaritan is
Big time. Yeah, story of the Good Samaritan. Having it almost like David marching across and seeing the Egyptian, didn't have to bother with the Egyptian. The Good Samaritan stopped and took care of this guy when he didn't have to. Having a generous heart changed the way he lived, didn't he? Great one. Any others? What's the big one, the elephant in the room? Yeah, dying on the cross. God gave everything. He didn't just give a little bit. He gave the most precious thing he had, his son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross and buy us back and purchase us. Such generosity when, God had the power to at the snap of his finger, change it all and not have to do that. But he did that. He gave everything he had in extravagant generosity. It wasn't just a little deal. Let's go to look at life of David here a second. 2 Samuel 24. 2 Samuel 24. Out parts of the life of David here. Some of the good parts is parts we're going to like to read. Some of the stuff we're going to get into is not going to be quite so. Someone want to read 2 Samuel 24, 1 and 2.
Again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go and take the census of Israel and Judah. So the king said to Joab and the army commanders with him, Go throughout the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and enroll by your name, so that I may know how many there are.
Okay. So what was the problem here? It said it really made God angry. What did David done here? Okay. And so David's command to Joab was to what in verse 2? Yeah. What would have been the purpose of that?
See how much wealth he had?
Yeah. Wealth and manpower, wasn't it? I want to know how many men I've got here. I want to see how much wealth we've got here. I want to know what's out there, because that's where his mind slipped to. This is where my strength is. Are the things that counts, and God was not a bit happy with that. And so some unhappy things happened. Verse 3, someone read 3.
And Joab
Go ahead, Jeff.
Joab replied to the king, May the Lord your God let you live to see 100 times as many people as there are now. But why, my lord the king, do you want to do this?
Yeah. So Joab was pleading with him, David, don't do this. Don't start counting your strength or the greatness of your kingdom that God has given you in the number of people and their wealth. So we've got some tension here as David is king. Let's go down to verse 10. This started to bother David. Someone take 10, 11, 12.
David was conscience stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, O Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. Before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord had come to the man, the prophet David's seer. Go and tell David, this is what the Lord says, I am giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you.
Okay. So what was bothering David? What does it say? Beginning of verse 10. What is the first thing that bothers David? His heart. David's heart was troubled because why? What does he say? And he said, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. So what is going to bother our hearts? First off, it's sin is going to get in the way. Sin is going to step in the way and break this thing. And that'll get into how do I keep one. If I can keep more and more sin out of my life, I'm going to have a more and more generous heart. And so David was having trouble there, and he realized it. He said, I've sinned. I messed up. And so God says to David what? Verse 13 or 12. I'm going to give you 3 choices. Pick one of these as your punishment. Which of these do you want to do? Which is kind of interesting. That's kind of a few of the only places you find that God says, okay, pick your poison, pick the things that you want to go wrong here. 13 and 14. Someone take those 2.
So Gad went to David and said to him, Shall there come upon you 3 years of famine in your land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you, or 3 days of plague in your land? Now then, think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me.
Hoofta. Yeah. First one was what? And they're all threes, kind of interestingly. Three years of what? Not a fun choice. Next three is what? Three, how long? 3 months, 90 days of running from your enemies. Why? Even if you could outrun them, what an embarrassment for the king of Israel to be running around fleeing enemies. You know, going to be a fun one. And the last choice, the third choice was what? 3 days of. So what do you envision that to be? What is it? What was a plague in those days? Yeah. We're not told specifically, but we can think back to the things that happened to the Egyptians. All of those plagues, the pestilences that came out. Probably going to be a personal thing, like a disease or 3 days of locusts flying all over, eating everything. We're not really given details. But he said, you've got these three choices to make, because sin always demands what? Payment. Sin always demands payment, no matter where it is, what it is. And David had to pay for this, and it was going to involve his people. So he starts looking around. Let's do 15 through 17. The pestilence is sent.
So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that point until the end of time, designated, and 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. And the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem. The Lord was grieved because of the calamity and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, enough, withdraw your hand. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Aruna, the Jebusite. And 17?
Let's stop there. So what happened? We are given a glimpse at it, aren't we? The pestilence that came across the land was a what? Led by an angel, wasn't it? An angel from God was going across the land. And how many people died? Pardon me? 70,000. 70,000 people died because of David messing up. Talk about feeling guilty. And that looks like it was one of the lesser of three things that could have happened. So David had to really feel terrible. And so it got so bad that middle of verse 16, God says what? No, stop it. We got to stop this. We can't go on with it. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Aruna, the Jebusite. And then someone take 17.
David saw the angel who was striking down the people. He said to the Lord, I am the one who has sinned and done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall upon me and my family.
Okay. A glimpse at David's heart when he saw this happening was what? David said to God, what?
Take responsibility.
Yeah. These people, he calls them sheep. These sheep didn't do anything wrong. It was me. I do not like their suffering. I do not want them paying the price for this. And he says, at the end of 17, please let thy hand be against me and against my father's house. Make this on me. Put it on me. And so he's by this guy's place, Aruna is his name, a Jebusite. 18, 19, 20, David is going to take a step here that's going to be quite remarkable, I think. 18, 19, 20.
Gad came to David and said to him, go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Aruna the Jebusite. So David went up to do what the Lord had commanded him. When Aruna saw the king and his men coming toward him, he came and bowed before the king with his face to the ground. Why have you come, my lord? The king asked. David replied, I have come to threshing floor and to build an altar to the Lord there so that he will stop the plague.
Okay. So we've got Araunah the Jebusite, and he's by this threshing floor where they were at for some reason where David said, or God said, okay, stop all of this killing, stop all of this destroying the people. And so David decides that he needs to build an altar there, which was a way of them showing their repentance, of remembering what God had done, remembering what he had done. This is my fault. It was a monument to his stupidity, I don't know, to his sin. And so it was something people were going to remember. So he goes to Araunah and says to him what?
We want to buy your.
Yeah. I want to buy this threshing floor, which was a large area, hard and flat, where they would thresh out their grain, even having animals going over it or big stones rolling over it, threshing out the wheat. So I said, I want to buy this place and I want to build an altar there. And 22, Araunah says back to David this here. So I'm going to read 22.
He said to David, let the Lord my king take whatever he wishes and offer it up. Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and here are threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood.
Okay, so Araunah's response to David was what? Take it. Here it is. You can have the floor. I've got all of the stuff you need to build the altar. Just take it. You can have the whole thing. So Araunah just offers it all to David. And he says, 23, everything, O king, Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God accept you. So he's offering this all. David's response to this is, I think, is remarkable. As a king, remember, he's the king of Israel, has all of this stuff, and could have demanded it from Araunah. And then he says this in 24. Someone would take 24.
The king replied to Araunah, no, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver.
Okay. David's response to Araunah was what?
I insist on paying.
Because I will not give to God that which costs me nothing. How big is that? I will not give to God that which costs me nothing. To me, that is profound. I could give God all kinds of things, but David chooses, I'm not going to give God something that costs me nothing. Why?
Not really a sacrifice.
Yeah. What's the sacrifice? Exactly. There is no sacrifice in giving something to God that's already God's or that costs you nothing. So this whole generous heart thing gets wrapped up in these words, I will not give to God something that costs me nothing. And it was, the seed for that was built back in Leviticus 17:11, where it says, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. So way back in Leviticus, God was saying there's going to be a sacrifice. Something has got to pay for these sinful things that are going on. It started back then, and we go all the way through this time into the New Testament where the sacrifice was Jesus on the cross. It cost God everything. And David was, I don't know if he knew what was happening, but he had this in his heart that God has given everything for me. I'm not going to give him something that doesn't cost me anything. How do we incorporate that idea into our lives? Where does that fit for you and I? Yeah, it's not going to be. Yeah, yep. Take out the easy part. Exactly. Was it easy for God to send Jesus? I don't think so. To watch him that last week of his life, it can't have been easy. So he set the example for us. What are we going to do to have extravagant generosity. I erased that part. Extravagant generosity takes sacrifice. What else? How can we fit that in to our lives? How is it going to fit in with when we're talking about evangelism, the people around you that you meet or that you see? Does it cost us something to have a generous heart to someone else who maybe doesn't know God, or God puts on our heart to talk to or to do something for them?
It can be really uncomfortable, and I think you can sometimes lose friends or family over it. You know, you could risk that.
You bet. So it's a sacrifice and it's a risk, isn't it? Big time. I am so, I don't know if tickled's the right word, thrilled that this church, what we do with the Stephen Ministries, packing meals, all of the things that I see going on at Good News here all year long that involve a generous heart, that take our time, that take not just, so often when we think about generosity or giving, it falls into, I'm paying a debt. You know, God asks us for 10%, and I think we're all guilty of that. I know I am. When I think of, I guess toward the end of the year, have I given my 10%? So you go in your mind, okay, how much money did I make this year, yada, yada. And when I write the last check out, I go, whew, got that out of the way. Is that a generous heart? I don't think so, because a generous heart doesn't have to do with paying back a debt, which is what tithing is. That stuff was never, 10% was never ours in the first place. So it's not about that at all. It's what comes after that. There was he's a pastor in Minneapolis, told a story about a fellow came to their church and said, when he just started, he says, are you a grace church or are you a law church? And the pastor said, well, we're a grace church. And he said, whew, I thought you were good. He said, I don't want you hounding me for a tithe. And he said, well, that's all right. He said, we're a grace church, which really means more. He said, we don't, the law would say don't murder, but grace says love your enemies, do good to those that are bad or want to harm you. That's grace. God says, or the law says, do not commit adultery. Grace says, don't even lust. It takes it so much further. When God says, be generous, it isn't just giving your tithe that's going so much further. Grace is not a way off of the hook of living under the law of God, kind of, but it is so much more than that. And so when we think of, we live under grace now, the pressure is off. I don't think so. We're not paying a debt. We're living it out. Get off my soapbox here. The last verse, 25, we'll see what David did.
He rebuilt an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. And the Lord answered prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped.
Okay. So it comes to a good conclusion, doesn't it? David builds the altar. The pestilence or plague, the dying of the Israelites is stopped. David comes to his senses, realizes that his power comes from God, not from his own might or the Israel's might. So we kind of bring that part of David's life to a conclusion right here. Let's go down to First Chronicles. We'll go ahead to First Chronicles 29. We're going to go to the end of David's life. Samuel King's Chronicles. Which is going to, it's going to kind of show, or not kind of, it's going to show us that David had a generous heart, a faithful heart toward God through his whole life, all the way till when he was an old codger and he could see the end of his end coming and his son Solomon taking over. So 1 Chronicles 29. Let's someone take the first 5 verses of 29. 29, 1 through 5.
Then King David said to the whole assembly, "My son Solomon, the one whom God has chosen, is young and inexperienced. The task is great, because this palatial structure is not for man, but for the Lord God. With all my resources I have provided for the temple of my God, gold for the gold work, silver for the silver, bronze for the bronze, iron for the iron, and wood for the wood, as well as onyx for the settings, turquoise stones of various colors, and all kinds of fine stone and marble. All of these in large quantities. Besides, in my devotion to the temple of my God, I now give my personal treasures of gold and silver for the temple of my God, over and above everything I have provided. For this holy temple, 3,000 talents of gold and 7,000 talents of refined silver. For the overlaying of the walls of the building, for the gold work and the silver work, and for all the work to be done by the craftsmen. Now, who is willing to consecrate himself today to the Lord?"
Okay, what's happening here at the end of his life? They're looking at doing what? Building the temple, which has been really a focus of giving God a place to, not a structure of the tabernacle that you could tear down, put up, but a permanent structure is what was on their mind. Who's going to build it? Solomon. Why?
David, what did he say to him? That he had murdered or he had done things, his hands were clean, and so he wanted his son to do it.
Yeah. David had too much blood on his hands. So what was thinking about it, I would think David would be ticked off. Who asked him to be the warrior for Israel? God did. So where was David when God called him? He was out in the pasture taking care of sheep. He didn't have blood on his hands other than the animals he killed trying to get the sheep. So God called him to be the warrior for Israel. And now God says, "You've got too much blood on your hands. You can't build a temple. What's up with that?" What do you think's what's going on? Wouldn't you be ticked off? I would, and yet when we read through this, I just can't find a place in there, I can't think of a psalm where David talks about being angry at God for not being able to build the temple. Just on the way other hand, what does he do?
He gives all this stuff to build it.
Yeah, a generous heart to the extravagant. He gives all of this stuff out of his own treasure. He isn't taking things from the Israelites. He's giving all of this stuff, all of these, and we're not used to the numbers, the talents, 3,000 talents of gold, 7,000 talents of silver, but it's a huge amount he gives. And at the last sentence in verse 5 says what? He's looking at the children of Israel, and he says what? Who of you is willing to consecrate yourself to doing this with me? Are we doing this? Am I doing this on my own? Who of you are willing to have a generous heart to do this as well? And so that was up for debate. He didn't know that they were going to or not. You never know. 6 through 9. Someone take those 4.
And the wages of the families, the officers of the tribes of Israel, commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, and the officials in charge of the king's work gave willingly. They gave toward the work of the temple of God 5,000 talents, 10,000 lerets, gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, and 100,000 talents of iron. And he who had precious stones gave them to the treasury of the temple of the Lord in the custody of Jehiel the Tishbite. People rejoiced at the willing responsibility, for they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord. They and the king
Okay, so what happened? You kind of laid this out to the children of Israel, said, are you going to help with this project? And what was the response of the Israelites? Kaboom! There was stuff coming in all over the place. 100,000 talents of iron, 10,000 talents of silver, all of this stuff came out, so there was more than enough that the people gave, which is cool. And then verse 8 says, and then he asked for precious stones, and they gave them to the treasury, to the care of Jehiel. Verse 9, then the people did what? They rejoiced because why? Yeah. There was no decree that went out. There was no law. There was no tax collector going around and saying, your family needs to give this much, your family needs to give that much. They gave freely. They were on their own, which demonstrates what? Generosity. This was over and above what they had to tithe or needed to tithe. This was a generous heart. It's cool there in verse 9. It says, they made their offering to God with a whole heart. They were wholeheartedly into it, not an obligation, not paying a debt, because they were all in. And then the last part, and King David also rejoiced greatly. What was he rejoicing about? I may have a little goofy twist. Huh? Yeah, their generosity. When you read it, just read it through, you think, well, maybe he was rejoicing because they got all of this stuff in and the temple was going to be built. But I really think that David was thrilled and rejoicing at their generosity. They get it. They finally get it. They are generous toward God the way God had dealt with him to build a generous heart in him. He is seeing all of these people do the same generous thing back to God. And that had to thrill David's heart to no end. They had to have a party like no other party that went on at the time. There had to be rejoicing, dancing, singing, because they had gathered all this stuff. The temple was going to be built, and it was all because not from a command, but from a generous heart. A generous heart takes intentionality. They intentionally gave to God to do this thing. I think that is so cool. Generosity is a normal outflow of love and the apex of what flows out of a sacrifice, which we talked about being a sacrifice. Erwin McManus, he had a quote that I found. It says, love isn't measured by how much we give, but how much it costs us. Love isn't measured by how much we give, but by how much it costs us. It is, you do not see people giving without loving, but you hardly ever see someone not giving if they love someone. If you love your children, if you love your spouse, you give. It's a natural outflow of being a human. You give to them. If you don't love them, you don't give. So it starts with loving God. I'm going to have to hit on that. Let's finish up with Hebrews 12:2. That there was the idea that there is great joy in giving, and it comes from God. Hebrews 12:2.
Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, avoiding shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God.
That verse is so cool. God was looking toward what was going to happen, and it says what? For the joy set before him. For the joy set before him, he did what? Endured the cross. What else? What else did he do in 12:2? Yeah. He endured the cross, didn't care about what it cost him. That was not the deal. And out of this was joy. There is great joy in having a generous heart. It is going to feel wonderful when you catch on to having a generous heart for God's things. It's a kind of a crazy deal, even though it's going to cost you. There's going to be sacrifice. It may cost you friends, relationships, reaching out to someone with a glass of cold water, reaching out to them with something small is going to bring you great joy. There is no way around it. That's just the way this whole thing is built. We're going to have to wind this up. I got 2 Chronicles 29. Did we do 9? I'm losing my marbles here. Chronicles. 2 Chronicles 22. No, I'm sorry. 1 Chronicles 29. Wow. Yeah, we did. The idea in verse 9 is that they rejoiced. Verse 10, we didn't read those. Verse 10 talks about them worshiping God. Blessed art thou, O Lord, of Israel, forever and ever. Down to verse 13. Now therefore, our God, we thank thee and praise thee for thy glorious name. Verse 16, O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided to build thee a house for thy holy name is from thy hand, and all is thine. And so it all came from God, is what they're saying. So that's what the took care of. Well, I want to. Would you want to play that slow down part? There's a song that if we're going to do this thing sometimes in our life now, we've got to slow things down. If we're going to stop and sit with our family and say, okay, who can we show kindness to you today? Tell our kids who in school can we show kindness today. It's going to take us to slow things down in our family just a bit, take 5 or 10 minutes. And Chuck has wrote this song called Slow Down. And I think in the kind of a hectic lifestyle we live in, this is so meaningful, is that God needs time. He needs us to slow down, think about others and what we're going to do for them. Good. We want the things of God, we've got to slow down. We've got to take the time to do it. We are not going to be able to participate in the things of God if we don't slow down and take time. God is not going to lasso us and take us down. We've got to slow down. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for this lesson. Keep us safe as we go back home, and help us to slow down, to hear your voice, to help you create in us a generous heart. Amen. Thanks.